This story on the history of Rockhampton and central Queensland is brought to you by Time Safaris, Rockhampton Walking Tours. Join us for a walk along Queensland's largest collection of heritage buildings and discover the history of the region, or take one of the spooky evening tours and uncover the murders and mayhem and if the real Jack the Ripper once stalked the dark alleys of Rockhampton. Today we are going all the way back to 1927, and our story begins here at one of Rocky's most famous landmarks, the Criterion Hotel. If you were standing on Quay Street at 11 AM on Thursday the 16th of June 1927, you would have seen something unusual by today's standards, though not something that would have been unusual at the time. You see, on this day, the crowds were lining Quay Street to watch the Great Rockhampton Goat Race. Turns out goat racing was big in the 1920s, with Rockhampton considered the goat racing capital of Queensland, which in turn suggests it was the goat racing capital of the world. Kids, the humankind, used goat carts at the time to help with their daily chores around the farm, and goat carts played an important part in their daily life and the culture of early Australia. Horses were expensive and goats were cheap, numerous, and apparently they took to the harness of the cart very well. A lot of these families were also immigrants who'd used goat carts in similar ways in their home countries. Now, this is Australia, so it wasn't long before goat racing became big business, and being Australia, illegal betting was rife. Unfortunately, so too was the act of nobbling, or sabotaging an enemy goat team. There are stories of individuals trying to win a race or a bet by pouring whiskey into their fellow racers' animals, or sneaking beer into their feed trough. A drunk racing goat would have been a sight to see, but it wasn't going to win one of these highly competitive races. On this Thursday, about a dozen kids sat on small buggies called spiders behind their favourite racing goats, waiting for the starter to drop the flag and start the race. The competitors would then sprint down Quay Street and cross the finishing line at the Criterion Hotel. The reason for this special race and the location of the finishing line? Well, it had been organised to celebrate the arrival in town of one of the world's most famous singers of the day, Dame Nellie Melba. Born Helen Porter Mitchell in 1861 in Melbourne, Dame Nellie was an Australian operatic soprano who took the name Melba to celebrate her hometown. She would become one of the most famous singers in the late Victorian era, and she was the first Australian to achieve international recognition as a classical musician. Starring in Paris, London and New York, in 1927 the Dame was touring Australia. One newspaper had reported that the world's most famous singer was going to arrive on Wednesday afternoon on the mail train from Brisbane. Thousands of locals were awaiting her arrival, but instead of some grand entrance, the opera singer simply got off the train and started moving through the crowd. Eventually someone must have recognised her and yelled out, "The lady in the brown coat is Melba!" And a little bit like the biblical Moses, the crowd suddenly parted in awe and respect, so Melba could pass through to her awaiting car. Now, at some point after her arrival, the Dame had asked about the famous goat racing the city was known for, and she was taken to watch the afternoon training sessions for Rocky's legendary goat champion, Kungal. This was a purebred goat that had not lost a race in some time. At some point it was decided a race would be arranged for the singer out the front of her hotel the following day. The singer was staying at the Criterion, where she could watch the race run in her honour and call out the winner. Come Thursday, word had got out, and the street was packed with people and goats, and the noise was becoming deafening as the excitement in the crowd grew and grew. As the time for the race neared, to everyone's disappointment, a local police constable arrived and broke up the carnival, pointing out no one had actually asked permission to run the race on a public road. Disappointed, before the entire crowd dispersed, someone suggested they move the race to the nearby showgrounds, and en masse the crowd and the singer moved across town for the race. This proved to be such a success that the race would be run again the following year, and for many years after that, and would eventually become the Melba Consolation Cup. This story of the all-conquering Kungal and the presence of the goat's admirer, the world's greatest opera singer, meant there were plenty of media on hand, and soon the story of the cancelled race became a news sensation across the country. This led to a bunch of exhibit races being organised for the best of Rockhampton's goat teams across New South Wales and Victoria, and their young riders were soon travelling the country becoming stars themselves. In fact, the timing of this was perfect, because Ordell Coyle Productions was filming their latest movie, based on the famous Australian newspaper comic strip, Fatty Finn. Now, the comic strip Fatty Finn was created for Sydney's Evening News by cartoonist Sydney Nichols to compete with other successful comic strips of the day, like Ginger Meggs. After going through a number of style changes over the next year, finally in 1924 the first true Fatty Finn comic was printed. The story featured a young Aussie schoolboy wearing a scout uniform and hat, living in a poor city suburb, who was constantly getting into trouble with everyone. As the years rolled on, the comic strip actually grew in popularity, with Fatty becoming more of a heroic figure in the stories than just a naughty boy causing hijinks. This popularity led to the character starring in his own feature film just a few years later. Called Kid Stakes, this Fatty Finn movie was written to end with the main character participating in a goat race. All the filmmakers needed now were some kids and some goat races. Luckily, the kids from Rockhampton that had failed to run their race for Dame Nellie Melba were on their national tour and were hired to act as the racers for the sequence. A few days later, the Sydney Movie Company had set up their cameras, and once more the Rocky goat racers were lined up, this time ready to hurdle down a Sydney street for their first take. However, just as the director was about to call action, a representative of the New South Wales government arrived and pointed out that goat racing in any form was illegal in the state. The goat race was once again cancelled. However, refusing to lose the main action sequence for their film, the movie company packed up their cameras and crew and moved north to Rockhampton. And here they filmed the goat race at the same showground the opera singer's race had been moved to. And here it is. Now, watching this film, you can see Rocky's champion goat Kongol. It's the large white one, and if you go back and closely look, you can see the goat has a bandage on its leg. Unfortunately, just before they began the race, the poor creature was attacked by a local dog. Luckily, the wound proved to be superficial, and after a quick bandage, the champion goat was placed in front of the camera, chasing the film's hero, Fatty Finn. Now pay attention to those people in the background. Knowing a big film was in town, Rocky's locals flocked to fill the stands and maybe get their face on screen. But what I love is you are watching the very kids and their goats who had lined up on Quay Street all those months earlier to run a race for Dame Nellie Melba. Now, sadly, the sport of goat racing would eventually lose interest, and there hasn't been a goat race in Rocky for some time. Recently, however, there's been a resurgence of the sport in Kalgoorlie. With all the safety protocols recognised, kids and their goats are racing once more, nearly a century after the great Rockhampton goat race. Now, this was just one story from Central Queensland, and for more, including the presence of the real Jack the Ripper, please book a time safari walking tour and find out about the bushrangers, bank robberies and characters that helped create the modern city of Rockhampton. And I hope to see you there.